A long time ago in the ever-distant 2010s, the superhero genre was booming. Chris Nolan's interpretation of Batman was taking comic book movies to new heights, and the newly formed Marvel Studios was hard at work building a lucrative cinematic universe with mostly solid and entertaining blockbusters. To put it simply, the nerds who grew up on comic book stuff were eating pretty good, and it wasn't long before the market was absolutely flooded with comic book adaptations. Now, while a fair amount of these projects attracted large audiences and generally drove pop culture, there were many that weren't exactly home runs. Enter Man of Steel, the 2013 Superman film directed by Zack Snyder that began the process of turning the DC brand into the gross, mutated sludge that it is today. From the start, Man of Steel was simply meant to be a reimagining of Superman that would take a lot of cues from Chris Nolan's more grounded Batman films. In fact, David Goyer, the guy who co-wrote those movies, is the same writer behind Man of Steel, and similar to what he did on Batman, his goal here was to reconstruct Superman for a modern-day audience, providing more context and personal motivation for the character along the way. Chris Nolan himself was moving on from comic book movies after The Dark Knight Rises, but he was fairly involved with this as well, throwing in some cash as producer, giving some input on the story, and recommending Zack Snyder for the director's chair, who, at the time, was seen as an ideal choice to bring larger-than-life comic book adaptations to the big screen. On paper, this all sounded great, and hopes were high that we'd be getting the Superman equivalent of Batman Begins. However, when Man of Steel finally came to fruition, I think it was clear to anyone with eyeballs that something was definitely wrong with this one. Many of the key elements like the plot, character motivations, and themes were executed pretty poorly. Zack Snyder's direction focused too much on the action and spectacle, which ironically didn't distract from the issues in the writing, but instead just made them much more noticeable. And a strong emphasis was put on reinventing or subverting the material that was being adapted, rather than being faithful to it. But before I dive too deep into any of these issues, let me give you a bit of a refresher on the plot.
What's this all about?
So, like many iterations of Superman, Man of Steel opens on the planet Krypton. We spend the bulk of our time there focusing on Superman's father, Jor-El, as he struggles to save both his newborn son Kal-El and his people from their planet's imminent destruction. However, this time around, a few things are added to this version of the backstory that complicate things a bit. To start, we learn that the Kryptonians caused their own planet's demise by exhausting its natural resources. Beyond that, we also learn that Kryptonian society is some kind of genetic caste system, where instead of people simply being born, they're selected and grown from the DNA contained in this weird skull called the Codex to perform certain roles in society, like doctor, soldier, stripper, etc. This makes baby Kal-El, aka Superman, Krypton's first natural birth in centuries, and leaves me with a ton of questions that I'll get to later. Anyway, Krypton's military leader, General Zod, wants to prune the bad bloodlines that led them to this point and take control of the Codex for himself. So he attempts a coup to do just that. In contrast to this, Jor-El is not a fan of the Build-A-Baby workshop, so he steals the Codex, binds it to Kal-El's DNA somehow, and then he sends his son to Earth in the hopes that the Kryptonian lineage can live on without all this genetic predeterminism crap. Zod then kills Jor-El for his unacceptable heresy, and later gets caught by the authorities. He shouts a bit about finding Kal-El. I will find him! Then he's encased inside a giant penis before being sent to an alternate dimension called the Phantom Zone, only to be conveniently freed later when the planet explodes. Fast forward about 30 years and we see an adult Kal-El, aka Clark Kent, on Earth working odd jobs under fake names and saving people with his powers when the opportunity presents itself. This is interspersed with flashbacks showing how Clark had to adjust to his powers throughout his childhood and how his surrogate parents, John and Martha Kent, urged him to keep his fantastic abilities a secret. Eventually, Clark winds up working at a bar where he overhears some soldiers talking about an alien craft that the military found buried in the ice. Clark heads out to find it and along the way encounters the tenacious journalist Lois Lane, who is also investigating the alien craft. Clark saves Lois from the ship's security system, leaves her with the military, then flies the ship up north to the Arctic. Luckily for Clark, this ancient ship just happens to be Kryptonian, and is compatible with this weird USB thing that Jor-El packed with him. When Clark inserts the USB into the old ship, a simulated version of Jor-El appears, providing a giant exposition dump about Krypton, a suit donning the symbol of the House of El, and a pep talk where he tells Clark to head out and give the humans an ideal to strive for. Meanwhile, Lois starts inquiring about the man who saved her, and her investigation leads her to discovering Clark's true identity pretty easily. When Clark returns home to Kansas, Lois tracks him down and tries to convince him of telling his story to the world. But Clark refuses and tells her how he let John Kent die in order to keep his powers a secret. More on that shit later. Soon after, a large craft enters Earth's atmosphere, and wouldn't you know it, it's General Zod, who found Earth due to Clark tampering with the ancient ship. He demands that Kal-El turn himself in, or Earth will suffer the consequences. Once there, we learn that Zod wants the DNA from the Codex so that he could start to rebuild Krypton's population. However, all isn't what it seems, as Zod and his forces are actually looking to wipe out all the humans, terraform Earth, and make a new Krypton in its place. As tensions rise and multiple headache-inducing fight scenes ensue, Zod's forces begin to deploy their planet-terraforming machine, the World Engine. Clark comes up with a plan where he'll go and destroy the World Engine, and the military will use some tech from the ship he arrived in to suck Zod's main ship back into the Phantom Zone. Through some trials and tribulations, this plan succeeds, but Zod himself still remains. Hell-bent on vengeance and overacting, Zod fights Superman through Metropolis, causing a ridiculous amount of destruction, and Superman is ultimately forced to kill him in order to prevent some innocent people from becoming Kentucky Fried. In the aftermath of saving the world, Clark reinforces his free agent stance with the US military and starts his first day as a reporter at the Daily Planet.
That's about it.
Alright, so now that I've got you up to speed, let me explain why little to none of this works. Number 1. The plot sucks, and it drags down the central characters. So, traditionally where Superman came from was never given a ton of importance. In the early days, it was just meant to be a simple explanation of his powers. More context was added over time, of course, and details vary from version to version, but Man of Steel truly makes Krypton the driving force of the plot, and in doing so adds a lot of things to this origin that are confusing, aren't properly explained, or are just plain unnecessary. To start, we're told that Krypton is collapsing for reasons that were both avoidable and self-inflicted. You see, apparently the people of Krypton once had a thriving civilization for thousands of years that even went as far as to branch out onto other planets. However, at some point in that history, for reasons unknown, artificial population control was established, and soon after the Kryptonians decided to stop expanding and go home. This retreat led to the Kryptonians exhausting their home planet's natural resources, namely its core, which is ultimately what caused Krypton to explode. That doesn't really make a lot of sense now, does it? I mean, if you're a spacefaring civilization, why would population control of all things ever need to be implemented? Wouldn't your people have more than enough room on all the other planets that you're colonizing? Furthermore, if you did ultimately decide to not live on those other planets for whatever reason, why would you then exhaust your own planet's resources to the point of complete collapse when you could have just used those other planets that you found, or even have gone there if you needed to? Why is all this part of the story anyway? Oh, that's right. Krypton has to explode, but while we're at it, we'll do some lazy climate change commentary or whatever.
There's something changing. We've screwed up water sources, built buildings on the most fertile land. We've made some really stupid mistakes. If this film puts that concept into the minds of young boys and young girls, then that's a wonderful thing. And if that's what, Superman means in this instance, fantastic.
Okay.
Beyond all that crap is all this Codex nonsense. What the hell is this skull? How does it contain so many different sets of DNA? And why are the Kryptonians using it as the source of all their people rather than just bumping uglies? When people are grown from this thing, do they even have free will? Or are they forever driven by their pre-selected role in society? I mean, Zod and the council members seem very stuck to their roles to a fault, almost like they can't see anything else but what they were meant to be. If that's the case, though, then why are Jor-El and Laura so independently minded, with their idea to save Krypton and have a child the traditional way, and so on? On that note, how is it even possible that Kal-El is the first natural birth in centuries? Do Kryptonians have no sex drive at all? What the fuck is going on here?
Oh, you can think about it, but don't do it.
Now, maybe I'm off my hinges, and I'm fixating too much on world-building elements that don't affect the story all that much. Except, I'm not, because these poorly explained ideas are the bedrock for the conflict between Jor-El and General Zod. You see, during Krypton's final days, both Jor-El and Zod take drastic actions that they think is their species' best chance for survival. And the rest of the plot revolves around the DNA and the proposed preservation of Krypton. The issue with that is that we just don't know enough about why this status quo even exists. And worse than that, the words and actions of both Jor-El and Zod sort of contradict their stated motivations anyway. As far as Jor-El is concerned, he seems to be against the way Kryptonian society is structured.
What if a child dreamed of becoming something other than what society had intended for him or her?
However, I can't help but wonder, what exactly did Jor-El want Kal-El to do with all that DNA he shipped him off with? Did Jor-El know that an ancient scout ship with a Genesis chamber was on Earth, and intend for Clark to find it and use it? I'd assume not, since Clark only learns about the ship from some random guys in a bar, and using the Codex and a Genesis chamber to grow more Kryptonians seems to be the exact thing that Jor-El was trying to get away from. If that was Jor-El's plan, though, he doesn't really bring it up to Kal-El when they talk, and I bet he'd be pretty mortified to know that his son ultimately decided to do this.
Krypton had its chance!
I don't know. Maybe Jor-El's intent was just for Clark to do a whole lot of fucking. What really blows my mind, though, is that when it's revealed that Zod wants to terraform Earth and use the Codex to make a new Krypton there, Jor-El's AI hologram seems to be fully aware of this, and says to Kal-El,
"We wanted you to learn what it meant to be human first, so that one day, when the time was right, you could be the bridge between two peoples."
But then, like 2 seconds later, he says this.
You can save her, Cal. You can save all of them.
Jeez, when you combine this weird DNA smuggling with Jor-El's more familiar Marlon Brando-esque speeches, it's no wonder why this Superman always looks so damn confused. Beyond Jor-El, General Zod's actions are at least more straightforward, but unfortunately, they're still pretty dumb. Yes, Zod wants to use the Codex to bring back Krypton and prune the genes that he deems undesirable. However, he also wants to use a giant machine to terraform Earth to be like Krypton before doing this. Now, my first question about this is simply, why? It's established that Earth's sun and atmosphere give Kryptonians insane abilities that essentially make them invulnerable, hence Superman. Even if I'm really charitable here and accept that Zod and his forces just aren't interested in that kind of power, if all they want to do is save their own endangered species, why would they not want to be as strong as possible, at least temporarily, until they get their numbers back up? I mean, those other Kryptonian outposts didn't do so hot for some reason, so it seems like they need every advantage they can get to survive. Putting that aside, though, I'm also confused as to why the new Krypton needs to be made on Earth at all. Zod could have gone to literally any other non-inhabited planet and terraformed it. Yeah, I know he wanted the Codex from Superman, but he could have just asked Superman for some DNA and gone to another planet to start anew. I mean, shit, I think if Zod came in good faith, Superman probably would have helped him do that. But no. Instead, when Zod shows up, he just tells Superman that he's gonna kill all the humans, so that we can get into that ball-numbing action.
You think you've abandoned my mother!
Perhaps the biggest disappointment of all here, though, is that Superman himself isn't even invested in this plot from a character standpoint. In concept, I think they were shooting for a conflict where Superman has to choose between the people of Earth and his true people of Krypton. However, there's never any real temptation there for Superman. Earth is the only home he's ever known, and Zod, being pretty hostile right from the start, simply wants to terraform it and turn it into a new Krypton, killing everybody there. This might have been more intriguing if Zod was asking Superman to go live with them on a new Krypton somewhere else, but by the time Zod's intentions are made clear, everything just boils down to Superman stopping this alien force from destroying the Earth. Which, at that point, you could replace the Kryptonians with any other group of super strong alien bad guys and nothing much changes about the rest of the movie. The extent of Superman's personal involvement in this plot is really to just be treated like a MacGuffin for a couple of scenes here and there in terms of all that stowaway DNA, until that's basically forgotten about as well. So, as you can see, the plot of Man of Steel is this weird, incoherent mess that, on the surface, hits the major beats of the classic Superman origin that you know, but also adds a bunch of unnecessary shit that muddles certain character motivations, overcomplicates, and ultimately ruins that simple origin story. Now don't get me wrong, environmental awareness, the extremes of eugenics, and authoritarian societies can all be fascinating subjects for stories in their own right, but thoughtlessly tossing all that shit into the mix while simply explaining where Superman came from was a huge mistake in my estimation.
Alright, what are you doing with this? What are you doing with it? Get this out of here for God's sake.
Number 2. Superman's internal conflict is kinda silly. Alright, so given that Superman is pretty alienated from the plot, no pun intended, what else is really going on with this guy in Man of Steel? Well, Clark's main source of internal conflict for roughly the first half of the film centers around whether or not he should reveal himself to planet Earth as a superpowered being. You see, throughout Clark's adolescence, we're shown that when bad things happen, he reacts instinctively and uses his powers to help. But we see at least 2 scenes where his adoptive father, John Kent, scolds him for this. Not because it was the wrong thing to do, but because it's too risky to reveal his powers to the world before the world is ready.
What was I supposed to do? Just let him die?
Maybe.
What? Bro, what are you talking about, man?
These ridiculous and morally bereft scoldings culminate in the infamous scene where John Kent sacrifices himself to a tornado while Clark stands by and does absolutely nothing. All because too many people will see if Clark were to use his powers. To stress just how stupid this scene is before I move on, moments prior to this we see Clark exhibiting a fair amount of rebellious teenage angst, which you would think would lead him to going against John Kent's advice here. But no. Furthermore, Clark had already been saving people with his powers in Smallville throughout his entire adolescence. So much so that it's sort of an open secret amongst many of the people in town already. And in this instance, we simply have a bunch of terrified people hiding under an overpass without phones, cameras, etc., because this is in the past. So if Clark had run out to save his father, sure, people would have seen it and been shocked, but who would really believe them? What kind of traction would this story really get beyond any of the other things that Clark has already done? This is all just so fucking silly, and it makes Clark's upbringing tragic for the dumbest reason imaginable. Honestly, the Richard Donner film had a much more relatable approach because it showed how Clark's powers couldn't solve every problem and how he couldn't save everyone. A much more valuable lesson for someone with insane powers to learn. Anyway, this event haunts Clark and compels him to continue keeping his powers a secret in order to honor John Kent's wishes. That is, until General Zod arrives and publicly demands that Kal-El come forward or watch Earth suffer the consequences. Now, all this caution about Clark revealing his powers stems from David Goyer's main angle when writing Man of Steel, which was that if an alien with Superman's abilities announced themselves to the world, it would be the most significant event in human history, challenging religions, philosophies, and so on. And the thing is, Goyer's probably right about that. In real life, if an alien with Superman's powers presented himself to the world, it would be an earth-shattering, divisive event. Some people would think he's a god, others would think he's dangerous, and the various governments of the world would probably seek to kill him, lock him up, or blast his ass off into space. Leaning into this idea is fine for a more grounded take on Superman, but I just disagree with how this is all handled in this movie. Sure, Clark revealing his powers publicly is going to be a big deal regardless, but I'd argue that there are definitely better and worse times to do it. For example, if Clark started publicly operating as Superman years prior to Zod showing up, and was consistent in being this super-friendly guy who regularly swoops in to save the day and proactively works to be as transparent and trustworthy as possible, I think it would have gone a long way to alleviating a lot of the potential backlash. Instead, Clark reveals himself only when Zod threatens the world, and the resulting conflict causes untold destruction on his first day as Superman. To the average person, a hostile alien race came out of nowhere, threatened the entire planet, attempted to destroy it, and then one of them who was already living here stopped them after wrecking half of a city. This isn't exactly the best road for being accepted or aspirational to the people of Earth. If anything, it starts the relationship between Superman and humanity off as something extremely frightening, negative, and full of mistrust. Aside from the public ramifications of revealing his powers, there is some lip service given to the protection of Clark's personal identity and safety, particularly when he's younger. This makes sense as another reason Clark may be hesitant about using his powers, but honestly, this could all be resolved too if he simply just masked his identity like almost every other superhero does. The fact that we, the audience, know that Superman is supposed to walk right up to people and save them showing his face is weirdly what Clark and John Kent seem to be worried about too. If Clark really just wanted to do the right thing, I think he'd find a reliable way to hide his identity from the world while also helping people. Sure, they would still likely have the same reaction to this super-powered person existing, but at least they wouldn't know who he really was. Now, I can already hear people complaining that I'm even suggesting this. After all, Superman doesn't wear a mask, and to give him one would be straying too far from the source material. I agree. But I do think it's funny how a lot of other controversial decisions, such as Superman breaking Zod's neck, are defended to death as just being realistic or all that he could do. But Clark masking his identity with a pair of glasses is still beyond reproach. I don't know, it's just a good example of how strange meta things can leak their way into a story. Kinda like Clark posing with the cape as a kid. Why are you posing like this? Where did you see that? A Superman cartoon? That's just fucking weird.
Gentlemen, I wash my hands of this weirdness.
Number 3. The action is hollow, and Zack Snyder's direction is completely tone-deaf. So, when you take into account the undercooked elements of the plot, the odd motivations, and the overall weak character work, it shouldn't be a surprise that when the action really gets going, it's not super engaging. I don't think I'm alone here either, as that seems to be a pretty common criticism of this movie. I mean, what's there to really get invested in once everything goes full-on Dragon Ball Z? The fight between Superman and General Zod's forces doesn't really address anything going on with Clark's internal conflict, or carry any real narrative weight. Sure, Clark is saving the world, but we really don't get any insight into what the people of Earth think of him now that he's revealed himself. At least, not in this movie. So it makes a lot of the stuff I mentioned earlier sort of feel like a waste of time that didn't really go anywhere. Beyond that, the players involved here are nearly invulnerable, and there are no interesting weaknesses being exploited, so all the action sort of just devolves into this brick of a protagonist crashing through buildings with a villain from a Saturday morning cartoon.
Where did you train? On a farm?
The straw that really breaks the camel's back, though, is that all this action is so over the top and goes on for so long that you can't really help but notice just how much shit is getting destroyed with each passing second. It gets to the point where you're not even thinking about the story anymore. Instead, you're just questioning Superman's actions as being extremely reckless when it comes to fighting these guys. Of course, I think a lot of the blame for this needs to be laid at the feet of Zack Snyder.
You could say, if I were Superman, that's what I would have done.
He just doesn't seem to have any awareness for when to pull back or how consistently the action lines up with the characters involved. Shit, even his sense of humor is completely tone-deaf. Like when Superman and Lois kiss, and Lois makes that cute little quip as thousands of people are dead or being crushed to death in the rubble behind them?
What the fuck is wrong with you?
I don't know. I guess I just find Zack Snyder's entire approach here to be so wrong for the character of Superman. From the mindless action that never seems to end, to the muted colors on the visual side, to the overbearing, self-serious tone, I just think Zack is a guy whose intention was never to faithfully adapt the source material at all. Which brings me to my next point. Number 4. A Superman movie made by people who don't like Superman. After looking back at Man of Steel and seeing all these issues, I can't help but feel that nearly all of them are the direct result of one common denominator. And that is that both Zack Snyder and David Goyer aren't interested in, and don't really have any respect for Superman.
I remember someone asking me in the press junket for Batman Begins whether or not I'd ever want to take a crack at Superman, and at the time I said no. I didn't have an affinity, or as close an affinity for the character as I had for Batman, and I think he's inherently harder because he's an alien, because he comes from another world, because he doesn't seemingly have as many vulnerabilities. It was a daunting task and a terrifying task. I remember, I had a basic pitch and we got the deal, to do it. And I remember sitting down at my computer and I was procrastinating. It was time to actually start writing the script. And I thought, oh my God, I don't know if I can do this.
I agree with that because I think Superman is broken and I think it needs to be fixed. And so I really feel like, if we can make a cool superhero movie, a Superman movie, and when Chris and Emma asked Debbie and I, and we went to lunch, they told us their story of what they wanted to do with Superman. And I gotta say, before, I was like, I don't know if I can Superman.
I said to Zack, really? I'm not really sure about this. And he's like, well, and then we said, okay, well, let's go see what they have to say.
Now, I'll agree that Superman did need to be made a little more grounded in order for general audiences of 2013 to get invested. I mean, I don't think a Cellophane S was going to be received very well, but I don't think they needed to fundamentally change who he is, or give him a complex backstory in the vain attempt to make him more interesting. He's not some angsty outsider who's unsure of himself and his place in the world. He's just a really good guy from Kansas, who was brought up to do the right thing and seek out the truth. Sure, he has a bunch of crazy powers, which he uses in his public persona as a superhero, but he still has a personal life and desires that can conflict with all that. In a way, you could sort of think of him like Spider-Man, but less nervous and with less bad luck.
My back! Oh, my back!
However, being that Superman has been around for so long, he's seen by a lot of people as being more of a symbol than an actual character. When viewed through this lens, he's the quintessential superhero, and the literal embodiment of truth, justice, and the American way. This caricature of Superman and superheroes in general were being directly criticized in comic books like The Dark Knight Returns and Watchmen way back in the 1980s. And those are just the kind of stories that get Snyder and Goyer all jazzed up. Now, there's nothing wrong with those stories, or criticizing the concept of superheroes, but there's definitely a time and place for it. And it's not when you're making a Superman movie. What I mean is that when it comes to Man of Steel, it kind of feels like nearly every decision made here was decided by saying, well, we can't just do that. We should throw a curveball instead. For example, we can't just have Superman's parents sending him away and the planet exploding. We should show Krypton as having a genetic caste system and Superman's parents rebelling against it. We can't just have the Kents support Clark in using his powers for good. We need to have them be paranoid about how the world will react and tell him how to hide his powers instead. Of course, the ultimate culmination of this is in the ending, where Superman breaks Zod's neck. Zack and David said, well, we can't just have Zod and his forces get sent back to the Phantom Zone. We should have Superman directly kill Zod to bring him down to our level a bit and subvert the audience's expectations. Now that last decision is by far the most controversial thing about Man of Steel, and for good reason. We have a character who in the source material has a strong aversion to killing, and in the real world is generally supposed to be geared towards families and younger audiences, breaking the neck of his foe in order to save the day. People defend this scene by saying things like he had no choice, or this will be the reason he doesn't kill in the future, but I think if we're all being honest here, we know that that's a bunch of crap. When it comes to these in-universe explanations, I don't agree with either one. Firstly, with how the situation is presented, Clark had at least 3 different ways he could have gotten around this. Number 1, cover Zod's eyes with your hand long enough for the people to get away. Number 2, push Zod back down to the ground long enough for the people to get away. Number 3, while you have Zod in the chokehold, drag him away and/or fly him up and out of the building as fast as possible. Remember that this is a character who's remarkably fast and strong, so it's pretty difficult to put him in a no-win scenario like this without taking away his powers or restraining him in some way. Secondly, the events of this scene are never discussed in this film or any subsequent films, so we have no idea how Clark feels about killing from a principle standpoint. He must not be too shaken up about it though, because he kills a terrorist without a second thought in the first few minutes of the next movie, and he doesn't seem to give a shit.
Alrighty then.
Beyond those tired explanations, people also try to defend this as being emotionally significant for Clark's character in some way. They say things like, oh, the scream of pain in having to kill the last surviving member of his race. It's so impactful. But what they fail to mention is that Zod is only the last surviving member of Krypton because Superman just torched the sperm bank.
Krypton had its chance!
What the fuck does killing Zod do for Clark's character in this story? He didn't have any kind of positive relationship with Zod, or any reverence for Krypton at all for that matter. He spent his entire life on Earth, and literally just found out about all this Krypton stuff a week ago, tops. Of course, the real reason this happened in the movie is quite simple. Zack and David just wanted to do something that excited them, which was to see Superman unable to do the right thing. That's it. What interests me is why. They could have done anything, and they decided to do this. Was Superman so uninteresting to them that they couldn't just make a movie where he wins the day by, I don't know, being clever or by showing a higher moral fortitude? I guess so.
These proceedings are closed.
Overall, I think Man of Steel is simply a mess of a movie that fails on almost every level. The plot is incoherent, the main character arc is a joke, and the style and tone are just all wrong for something like Superman. But what really irks me the most about it are the misguided intentions of the people behind it. David Goyer set out to make Superman more down-to-earth and relatable, but ironically he leaned so hard into the fact that Superman is an alien that he achieved the exact opposite. In this film, Clark Kent literally has no defining character traits beyond those tied directly to his powers. How is that more relatable than him just being a well-meaning guy from Kansas? Beats me. Meanwhile, Zack Snyder's goal was simply to try and make Superman cool. But I'm afraid that his definition of cool just means hitting hard, flying fast, and looking stoic. Little does he know that those surface-level bullet points have nothing to do with why Superman has endured in the culture for so long. Do you know why?
It's the smell.
No. What? It's earnestness, determination, and kindness that make Superman special. But I don't think Zack is really capable of understanding that.
You could say, if I were Superman, that's what I would have done.
At the end of the day, I think these misguided creative intentions are the real reason why Man of Steel failed to connect with so many people, and why watching it will always feel like the cinematic equivalent of trying to fit a square peg into a round hole.
We gotta find a way to make this fit into the hole for this, using nothing but that.